Cold, not cool. Cold. The specific cold of a body that has stopped making its own heat. The cold that makes a mother pull her hand back the first time she touches her dead child's cheek, because something deep in her brain, older than language, older than thought, knows that this is wrong. This is not sleep. Sleep is warm. You have felt the edge of this, even if you have never touched a body. You have stood in a hospital room and watched a chest, waiting for it to rise. You have leaned close to someone you love in the worst hour of the night and counted the seconds between breaths and felt your own heart drop into your stomach when the next breath took too long. That waiting, that terrible animal waiting for the next breath. Now imagine the breath never comes. And then minutes later or days later, it comes anyway. That is what this video is about. Every culture that has ever existed has built a wall around this one fact. The pyramids are a wall. The funeral is a wall. The headstone with the 2 dates and the little dash between them is a wall. Every civilization in human history has agreed on exactly one thing: that the dash ends, that the second date is final, that whatever a person was, when the breath stops, it is over. No appeal, no second hearing. The most certain thing in the universe is that the dead stay dead. You know it the way you know the sun is hot. You have never once in your entire life seen it go the other way. And that is precisely why these next 10 stories were written down. Not because death reversing was common, because it was the one impossible thing. The single locked door at the back of every human life that nobody in the whole history of the species had ever opened from the inside. 10 times. The Bible records 10 times when a human body that had stopped, a body already cold, in one case already 4 days into the grave and beginning to rot, started again. 10 times when death had won, had closed the case, had been signed and witnessed and wrapped in cloth. And 10 times death had to give the body back. But here is the thing almost nobody tells you. 9 of those 10 people died again. Every one of them. The widow's son, the little girl, the man 4 days in the tomb, all of them grew old or grew sick. And one ordinary day, their breath stopped a second time, and that time it stayed stopped. 9 resurrections. 9 funerals. The second time around. Only one of the 10 walked out of his grave and never went back in. Only one. Hold on to that, because everything in this video is moving toward that one. This is not a story about 10 miracles. This is not a story about 10 lucky people who got a few more years. This is not a story about a magic trick performed by holy men. This is a story about what death actually is, and what death, it turns out, is not. So let's go to the first one. Let's go all the way back, nearly 900 years before Jesus was born, to a starving widow in a foreign town, holding the body of the only thing she had left. The town was Zarephath on the coast in what is now Lebanon. There was a famine so severe that when the prophet Elijah first met this woman, she was gathering a few sticks to bake one last small loaf of bread for herself and her son, and then, in her own words, to lie down and die. That is where she started. The bottom. A widow, which in the ancient world meant no income, no protection, no future. and one son. One. Her entire reason to keep getting up in the morning. And then the son got sick. The scripture says his illness grew worse and worse until there was no breath left in him. Read that slowly. No breath left in him. She had survived the famine. She'd survived the loss of her husband. She had survived on faith in a jar of flour that somehow never ran empty. And now the one thing she could not survive was lying still on a mat in the corner of her house. And you have to understand what a son meant to a woman like this. In that world, a widow with no son was not just lonely. She was finished. There was no pension. There was no safety net. A woman's protection, her food, her standing, her old age. All of it ran through the men in her household, and she had exactly one. A boy. That boy was not only her child, he was her entire future. The one thread holding her over the cliff. When his breathing stopped, hers might as well have stopped too, because everything that came after, the hunger, the begging, the slow disappearance of an unprotected woman in an ancient town, all of it had just been set in motion by a child's last breath. She wasn't only grieving a son, she was watching the rest of her own life collapse in real time. You know what she did? She got angry at the prophet. She didn't pray a beautiful prayer. She turned on Elijah and basically said, "What did I ever do to you? Did you come here just to remind God of my sins and kill my boy?" That is grief talking. That is the rawest, most honest sound a human being can make. And the Bible does not clean it up. It leaves it exactly as ugly and exactly as real as it was. Here's what most people miss about what Elijah did next. He didn't wave a staff. He didn't shout. He carried the boy upstairs to his own bed, and then he stretched himself out on top of the child, body to body, his full length over the boy's small frame, 3 times. And he cried out to God, and the life came back into the boy, and the boy revived. 3 times he covered the child with his own body before the breath returned. Remember that detail? It is going to echo. Elijah carried the living boy back down the stairs and put him in his mother's arms. And he said 5 words that are the entire point of this video. "See, your son lives." And the widow, who had cursed him an hour ago, said, "Now I know you are a man of God, and the word in your mouth is truth." That's grief turned to wonder in the space of a single afternoon. Beat 1, but it gets stranger. Because the very next prophet in line did almost the same thing, and somehow made it even more intense. Elisha was Elijah's successor. He had asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit, and the Bible seems to take that request seriously, because the miracles around Elisha come twice as fast and twice as strange. And one of them involves a woman with no name. We call her the Shunammite, after her town, Shunem. She was wealthy. She was kind. She built a small room on her roof so the traveling prophet would have somewhere to stay. And she had no child, and her husband was old, and Elisha, to thank her, promised her that within a year she would hold a son. She did. The boy was born exactly as promised. And then, years later, out in the fields at harvest time, the boy grabbed his head and screamed, "My head, my head." They carried him to his mother. He sat on her knees until noon, and at noon, he died. Picture that. Picture holding your child on your lap through the slow hours of a morning, watching, doing everything, and at midday, feeling the weight in your arms, change from a sick child to a still one? You who are a parent know there is no language for that. There isn't. The Bible doesn't even try. It just says, and then he died. What the woman did next is one of the most controlled, ferocious acts of faith in the entire Old Testament. She did not collapse. She carried the body up to the prophet's room, the room she had built, and she laid him on the prophet's bed, and she shut the door. And she told no one he was dead, not her husband, not the servants. She saddled a donkey and rode straight for the mountain where Elisha was, and when his servant tried to ask her what was wrong, she said 2 words, "All is well, all is well," with her dead son lying behind a locked door. That is not denial. That is a woman who has decided that the story is not over yet, and she is not going to let anyone write the ending before she gets to the one person she believes can change it. Think about that ride for a second. The mountain where Elisha was staying, Mount Carmel, was something like 15-20 miles from Shunem. That is hours on a donkey in the heat, alone with the image of your son's still face burned into the back of your eyes the entire way. She told the servant driving the animal, "Drive, and do not slow down for me unless I tell you." She would not stop, she would not eat, she would not weep where anyone could see. She held the whole catastrophe inside her body across 20 miles of road because she had decided that her grief could wait. But the prophet could not. When she finally reached him and fell down and grabbed his feet, and his servant tried to shove her away, Elisha said, "Leave her alone. She is in bitter distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me." Even the prophet didn't know yet, but she did. She had carried it the whole way. Stay with me because the resurrection itself is even more physical than Elijah's. Elisha came. He went into the room alone and shut the door. He prayed, and then he climbed onto the bed and lay on the boy, mouth on mouth, eyes on eyes, hands on hands. The prophet pressed his living body against the dead one until the cold flesh began to grow warm. He got up, walked back and forth across the room, climbed onto the boy again, and the child sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes 7 sneezes. The Bible counts them. It wants you to hear them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Each one a fistful of air rushing into lungs that had been empty for hours. And then Elisha called the mother, and he gave her son back to her, and she fell at his feet and bowed to the ground and picked up her boy and walked out. 2 prophets, 2 dead children, 2 reversals. And in both cases, the man of God didn't stand at a distance and command. He got down onto the body. He covered death with his own warmth. Hold that thought. It will come back at the end with a force you are not expecting. Now, the 3rd Old Testament resurrection is the strangest of all 10, and the one that almost no one has ever heard of. Elisha died. Yes, the great miracle-working prophet, the one who raised the Shunammite's son, eventually grew sick and died like everyone else, and they buried him in a tomb. And here the Bible drops one of its oddest sentences, almost in passing, like it isn't even a big deal. Sometime later, raiders from Moab were sweeping through the land. A group of Israelites was in the middle of burying a man, carrying the body to the grave, when they spotted the raiders coming. There was no time, so they did the only thing they could. They threw the dead man into the nearest open tomb and ran. And the nearest open tomb happened to be Elisha's. The scripture says, as soon as the man's body touched the bones of Elisha, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. That's it. That's the whole story. No prophet, no prayer, no one even trying to raise him. A dead man touches the bones of a dead prophet and stands up. The power that had been in Elisha's hands was apparently still in Elisha's bones, even after death. Like heat, still radiating from a stone long after the fire has gone out. Here's the part nobody tells you. This is the only resurrection in the entire Bible where no living person is involved, no faith, no request, no command. It is almost as if the Bible is making a point that the power to reverse death does not actually belong to the prophets at all. It only ever passed through them. It belongs to someone else. We'll get to who. And once you notice that, you start to see it everywhere in these stories. Elijah did not say, "By my power live." He cried out to God and asked him to give the life back. Elisha shut himself in a room and prayed before he ever touched the boy. Peter knelt down and prayed before he turned to Tabitha. Paul said the life was in the young man. He did not say he had put it there. Every single one of these people was a conduit, not a source. They were like a length of copper wire. The wire glows. The wire can kill you. But the wire did not generate the current. It only carried it. And the strangest resurrection of all, the man and the bones, strips even the wire away. No prophet praying, no apostle kneeling, just the residue of a holy life still humming in a pile of bones in the dark, and a dead man brushing against it and standing up. The Bible seems almost to be daring you to ask the obvious question. If a dead prophet's bones still carry that much of it, then how much of it must the source itself contain? Hold that question. It has an answer, and the answer is a person. So that's three Old Testament reversals. A widow's only son, a wealthy woman's promised son, and a nameless man who fell into the right grave at the right moment. Death, 3 times made to let go. And if you've made it this far, do me one favor before we cross over into the New Testament, because the next 7 are going to escalate fast. If this is the kind of biblical deep dive you wish more people made, the kind that takes the strange details seriously instead of skipping past them, then subscribe. That's it. That's the whole ask. There are around 365 resurrection-adjacent stories, prophecies, and patterns in Scripture, and I'm working through the ones nobody talks about, one video at a time. Subscribing tells the algorithm to show this to the next person standing at a graveside, wondering if death really is the end. So hit it, and then come back, because the next person to reverse a death does not climb onto the body at all. He doesn't even touch it at first. He just walks up to a funeral that has nothing to do with him and stops it. The town was Nain, a small place in Galilee. And what makes this one different from the first 3 is that nobody asked. Nobody sent for help. There was no faith-filled mother riding a donkey up a mountain. There was just a funeral already in motion coming out through the town gate. A man had died. The Bible is careful to tell you exactly who he was. The only son of his mother, and she was a widow. There it is again. A widow, an only son. The exact same trap that closed on the woman in Zarephath 9 centuries earlier. no husband, no other children. In that world, this woman was now completely alone, and the dead body being carried out of the gate was not just her grief, it was her destruction, the end of her name, her security, her old age, everything. And you need to see the scene the way the first listeners would have seen it. A Jewish funeral in that era was loud, and it was public, and it moved fast. The body was wrapped and carried on an open wooden plank. Often the same day death occurred, out through the town gate to the burial caves, because the law did not permit burial inside the town walls. The mourners walked behind, and the custom was for everyone who passed to join the procession for a few steps. So a funeral gathered people the way a river gathers water. By the time it reached the gate, half the town was walking with her. And at the very front, leading the whole crowd, walked the woman who had lost everything. Two crowds were about to collide at that gate. A crowd following death out of the town, and a crowd following Jesus into it. And only one of those two crowds was about to turn around. And Jesus, walking into town with a crowd, met the funeral coming out. And the Bible says, and I want you to feel the weight of this, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. He saw her. Before anyone explained anything, he saw a woman walking behind a coffin, and something in him broke open. He said to her, "Do not weep," which is, on its face, an outrageous thing to say to a woman burying her only son. You don't say that unless you're about to make it true. He walked up and touched the bier, the open plank the body was carried on. And everyone froze, because touching the dead made you ceremonially unclean. You did not do that. And then he spoke directly to the corpse. "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus, in a detail that ought to wreck you, gave him back to his mother. Gave him back to his mother. The exact phrase used of Elijah. The exact phrase used of Elisha. 3 reversals, 3 sons handed back into the arms of a weeping woman. The pattern is being built on purpose. Someone is laying down a track, and we are riding it toward a destination. Now watch what happens next, because the second resurrection of Jesus' ministry is the most tender, and it comes with words in a language you can still hear. A man named Jairus came and fell at Jesus' feet. And this is significant. Jairus was a ruler of the synagogue, an important, respectable man. Exactly the kind of man who was supposed to be suspicious of this traveling preacher. But his daughter was dying. His little girl, 12 years old, his only daughter. And when your child is dying, your title falls off you like a coat. He fell in the dirt and begged. Jesus went with him. But on the way, he was delayed. There was a sick woman in the crowd. A whole other miracle. And while Jesus was delayed, the worst possible message arrived. Messengers from Jairus' house. "Your daughter is dead. Don't trouble the teacher anymore. Don't trouble him anymore. It's over." Too late. And here's a detail the Bible buries that will break your heart if you catch it. The woman who delayed him, the one whose healing made Jesus stop walking long enough for the little girl to die, had been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years. And Jairus' daughter was 12 years old. So for the entire length of one woman's suffering, the other had been alive. One little girl had been growing up, learning to walk, learning to laugh for exactly as long as one grown woman had been slowly bleeding to death in the shadows. And on this single afternoon, on the same dusty road, in the space of a few minutes, Jesus reached down and answered both 12s at once. He did not see an interruption. He saw 2 daughters. The Bible even has him called the bleeding woman that, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Moments before, he walks into a house to raise another man's daughter from the dead. And Jesus turned to this shattered father and said 5 words that I think are some of the hardest and most beautiful words in the Bible. Do not fear, only believe. They got to the house, and it was already full of the noise of professional mourners, wailing and playing flutes. That was the custom. And Jesus said something that made them laugh at him. He said, "The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed. They laughed at him because they had seen the body. They knew dead when they saw it. But here is one of the most important words in this entire video. The Greek word the New Testament keeps using for these moments is agero. It means to wake up. It is the ordinary word you'd use for shaking someone out of sleep in the morning. And the New Testament uses that same word, agero, for rising from the dead. Because to the one who made the human body, the difference between waking a sleeper and raising a corpse is a difference of degree, not of kind. To you and me, one is impossible. To him, both are just getting someone up. He put everyone out. He took the girl's mother and father and 3 of his closest friends, and he went into the room where the body was. He took her by the hand, and he said in Aramaic, the actual everyday language he spoke, the words preserved for us exactly as they left his mouth. Talitha, koum. It means, "Little girl, get up." Some translations soften it even further, more like, "Honey, it's time to get up." The gentle thing a parent says at the side of a bed in the morning, and her spirit returned, and she got up at once and started walking around. And Jesus, in a detail that tells you everything about him, told them to give her something to eat. The God who just defeated death is concerned that the 12-year-old is probably hungry. That's the kind of God we're talking about. Pay attention to this, because we're now climbing toward the most famous resurrection before the resurrection. And it's the one where Jesus waited on purpose and let his friend stay dead and wept anyway. Lazarus. You may know the name. He lived in Bethany near Jerusalem with his 2 sisters, Martha and Mary. And they were close to Jesus. The Bible flatly says Jesus loved them. So when Lazarus got dangerously sick, the sisters sent for Jesus immediately. The message was simple and desperate. "Lord, the one you love is sick." And Jesus, this is almost unbearable, deliberately stayed where he was for 2 more days. He let Lazarus die on purpose. By the time he finally arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb 4 days. 4. In that climate, decomposition was well underway. There was a Jewish belief at the time that the soul hovered near the body for 3 days and then departed for good. So 4 days was past the point of any hope at all. 4 days meant nobody could say he had only fainted. 4 days was a sealed verdict. And the burial itself made the situation worse, not better. The body would have been washed and wrapped tightly in strips of linen, packed with about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. Spices meant not to preserve the body, but to fight the smell of what was already happening to it. Then it was laid on a stone shelf inside a cave, and a heavy disk of rock was rolled across the entrance to keep out animals. There was no embalming. Nothing was done to stop decay. Everything was done to manage it, to mask it, to wall it off. So when Jesus asked them to roll the stone away, he was not asking them to open a peaceful resting place. He was asking them to break the seal on 4 days of corruption. They knew exactly what was behind that stone. That is why what Martha says next is so raw. Martha came out to meet him and said the thing every grieving person has wanted to scream at God. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. If you had been here, where were you? The oldest prayer of pain there is. And then Mary said the exact same words. And then John records the shortest verse in the entire Bible, 2 words in English. Jesus wept. Stop on that. He was about to raise Lazarus. He knew in the next 10 minutes that dead man was going to walk out of that tomb breathing. And he still wept. He stood at the grave of his friend and the tears ran down his face. Because grief is real even when you know the ending. Because the God of the Bible does not stand at a distance from your weeping. He stands in it with wet eyes. Even when his hand is already on the stone, they rolled the stone away. Martha warned him about the smell, and the Bible, with brutal honesty, lets her say it. Lord, by now there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. And Jesus prayed out loud, and then he called into the dark mouth of the tomb in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. One ancient teacher made a chilling point about that command. He said Jesus had to say the name, Lazarus, because if he had simply said, come out, every grave on earth would have emptied at once. The voice was that powerful, he had to aim it, and the dead man came out, still wrapped head to foot in the burial cloths, stumbling into the light. And Jesus said, unbind him and let him go. Now here is where the open loop tightens, because Lazarus, like the widow's son, like the Shunammite's boy, like the girl, like the young man of 9, Lazarus eventually died again. There is a tomb somewhere with his name on it, the second one. 6 reversals now, and every single person is going to need a funeral all over again. The pattern is almost cruel. Death keeps losing the battle and winning the war. Death gives the body back, and then waits, and comes for it again. Unless something changes the rules entirely, hold that, because before we get to the one who changes the rules, the power to raise the dead does something remarkable. It jumps. It leaves Jesus' hands and lands in the hands of ordinary men, frightened fishermen, a former killer of Christians, and it still works. In a town called Joppa, there was a woman named Talitha, in Greek, Dorcas, and she was, the Bible says, full of good works and acts of charity. She made clothes for widows. When she died, they washed her body and laid her in an upstairs room, and the widows she had cared for stood around weeping, holding up the tunics and coats she had sewn for them with her own hands. Can you see it? The grief of poor women holding the clothing of the one person who ever looked out for them. And remember what we said a widow's life was like. No income, no protection, no thread to hold them over the cliff. Tabitha was the thread. She was the one woman in Joppa who looked at the widows. Everyone else stepped around and made them something warm to wear with her own hands. When she died, it wasn't only a kind woman who was gone. It was a whole little network of survival that had just collapsed. Those women weren't only crying for a friend. They were crying because the person who kept them alive was lying on a table upstairs, and the next cold season was coming, and now there was no one. That is the desperation that sent them running for help. They sent for Peter. And Peter, who had denied Jesus 3 times, who was a fisherman, not a prophet, Peter put them all out of the room exactly the way he had watched Jesus do it. He knelt down. He prayed. And then he turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, arise." In Aramaic, that would have been almost identical to what Jesus said over the little girl, "Tabitha, koum," instead of Talitha, koum, 1 letter apart. He was doing what he had seen done. And she opened her eyes and saw Peter and sat up. And then in another city, the Apostle Paul. And this one almost has a dark comedy to it. Paul was preaching late into the night, and he kept going and going past midnight. A young man named Eutychus was sitting in a window on the 3rd floor, and he did what any of us would do during an extremely long sermon. He fell asleep, and then he fell out the window, 3 stories down, and he was picked up dead. And the Bible gives you the reason he was in that window, and it is painfully relatable. It was an upper room packed with people, and the text says there were many lamps burning. Many lamps in a crowded room on a warm night, all of them eating up the oxygen and pouring out heat. And a teenage boy crammed in among the adults, eyelids getting heavier, edging toward the one window in the room where there was a little cool air, perching on the sill to stay awake. And it worked right up until it didn't. He nodded off. The night air took him, and he was gone before he hit the ground. Picture the sermon stopping. Picture Paul mid-sentence, watching the crowd surge to the window and then down the stairs. Picture the sound that goes through a room when people find a body. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man. There it is again, the body covering the body, the same posture as Elijah and Elisha 800 years before, and embraced him and said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And the boy lived. And then almost unbelievably, Paul went back upstairs and kept preaching until daybreak. The Bible notes that the people were not a little comforted, which might be the greatest understatement in Scripture. So now count them. 8. The widow's son, the Shunammite's son, the man in Elisha's tomb, the young man of Nain, Jairus' daughter, Lazarus, Tabitha, Eutychus. 8 times death was forced to let go. 3 by prophets, 3 by Jesus, 2 by his apostles. And every one of those 8 people eventually died again, which brings us to the only 2 that are left. And these last 2 are not like the other 8 at all. Quick word before the climax, because what comes next is the whole reason the other 8 matter. If this video has given you even one detail you'd never noticed in stories you thought you knew, the single most helpful thing you can do is leave a comment with the number of the resurrection that surprised you most, 1 through 8. It genuinely helps more people find this. Now, the last 2. Go back to the day Jesus died. The sky went dark in the middle of the afternoon. Jesus cried out and gave up his spirit. And in that exact moment, 3 things happened at once. The veil of the temple, the massive curtain that separated people from the holy place, tore in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, and the rocks split. And then Matthew records something so strange that many people read right over it. The tombs were opened, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised. And coming out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection, they went into the holy city, Jerusalem, and appeared to many. Read that again. When Jesus died, graves cracked open. And when Jesus rose, 3 days later, the people in those graves walked back into the city and were seen by their own families. We don't know their names. We don't know how many. The Bible just says many. Imagine being in Jerusalem that week. Your grandmother, dead for years, walking up the street toward you. This is resurrection number 9, and it's a crowd, not a person. And it happens in the wake of something even bigger. The way debris gets pulled along behind a great wave. And notice the timing, because Matthew is very precise about it. And almost everyone misses it. The tombs cracked open at the moment Jesus died on Friday afternoon. But the people inside them didn't get up and walk into the city until after Jesus himself rose on Sunday. So for about 3 days there were open graves around Jerusalem with the dead inside them, stirring but not yet leaving, as if they were waiting for him to go first. None of them could lead the way out of death, because none of them had ever beaten it. They could only follow. So they waited in their broken open tombs until the one who could go first went first. And then they came out behind him and walked home. It is one of the eeriest and most beautiful sentences in the whole Bible, and the church has argued about it for 2,000 years. But the picture it paints is unforgettable. A man dies, and the ground splits. The man rises, and the dead follow him out. He does not just escape the grave. He drags a crowd out with him. The first fruits, and then the very beginning of the harvest, all in one weekend, because of the wave itself. Number 10, here's where everything we've been building changes shape. For 45 minutes, you have been watching the same scene over and over. A body stops. A holy person prays or commands or covers the body with their own. The breath returns. And then, always, every time, no exceptions in the first 9. That person grows old and dies a second time, for good. 9 reversals. 9 delays. 9 people handed a few more years and then handed back to the grave. The 10th man was crucified by the Roman government under a governor named Pontius Pilate. This is not just in the Bible. The Roman historian Tacitus, who had no love for Christians, wrote that Christus was executed by Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. The Jewish historian Josephus mentions him too. This was a real execution of a real man in a real year, witnessed by a hostile crowd, certified by professional Roman executioners whose own lives depended on making sure their victims were actually dead. A soldier ran a spear into his side to confirm it. He was dead, sealed in a tomb. A stone rolled across. Guards posted, and understand who was doing the verifying. A Roman execution squad was not a group of amateurs. Crucifixion was the empire's most refined method of killing slowly and publicly, and the soldiers who ran it had done it hundreds of times. If a condemned man came down from a cross alive, the soldiers responsible could be executed in his place. So they did not guess. When they came to break the legs of the men on the crosses to speed their deaths, they looked at Jesus and saw he was already gone, so they didn't bother. They drove a spear up under his ribs instead. And the eyewitness says blood and water came out separately, which is exactly what modern doctors say you'd expect from a body whose heart has already stopped. These men signed off on this death with their own lives as the bond. Then the body was wrapped, sealed in a borrowed tomb, and a Roman guard was placed in front of the stone, because even his enemies were afraid of what might happen next. And on the third day the stone was found rolled away, and the tomb was empty. Now here's the difference that this entire video has been walking toward. When Lazarus came out, he came out wrapped in his grave clothes, stumbling, still bound, and someone had to unwrap him, because he was going to need those clothes again someday. When Jesus came out, the grave clothes were left behind, lying there. The cloth that had covered his face folded up by itself in a separate place. He didn't need them anymore. He was never going to use them again. That is the whole thing. That is the open loop. Finally, closing. 9 people were resuscitated, brought back to the same kind of dying life they had before on a clock that was still running. 1 man was resurrected, raised into a life that death cannot touch a second time. There is even a specific Greek word for it, anastasis. It doesn't just mean came back. It means a standing up that stays standing, a permanent rising. It is used for what happened to Jesus, and it is the word the New Testament uses for the promise made to everyone else. And the New Testament has a farming word for what that makes him. It calls him the first fruits. In an ancient harvest, the first fruits were the very first stalks of grain to come ripe. And a farmer would bring that first small handful to the temple, not because one handful mattered, but because it was a promise. The first fruits meant the rest of the field was coming. It meant the harvest had started. So when the Bible calls Jesus the first fruits of those who have died, it is making a staggering claim that his empty tomb is not a single strange exception, not a one-off, not a museum piece to admire from a distance. It is the first stalk. It means the whole field is coming up behind him. 9 people were brought back as proof that it could happen. 1 man rose as proof that it will. And think about what we saw 3 separate times in the oldest stories. Elijah stretched his own body over the dead boy. Elisha pressed his own warmth, mouth to mouth, into the cold child. Paul threw himself onto the young man. Over and over the pattern was, the living covers the dead with his own body to give it life. On the cross, that pattern reached its end and its meaning. The one with the life laid his own body down over a dying world. He didn't lie on top of one boy. He covered all of it. He took the cold into himself. He went into the grave personally, not to perform a miracle from the outside, but to be the body in the tomb and then to be the first one out, the first of a whole coming harvest, so that the door he walked through would stay open behind him, which means death is not what you have been afraid it is. Death is not a wall. Death is not the end of these 10 stories. Death is not the villain who finally wins. Death, it turns out, is a door. And there are footprints leading through it, going out the far side, and the one who made them is holding it open and calling names into the dark. Lazarus, come out. Talitha, koum. Little girl, get up. Tabitha, arise. Young man, I say to you, arise. There is one more piece of evidence I want to leave you with, and it's not from the Bible. Around the year 125, a Christian named Quadratus wrote a defense of the faith to the Roman emperor. The early church historian Eusebius preserved a piece of it, and Quadratus made a startling argument. He said the people Jesus healed and raised from the dead were not rumors or legends, because some of them, he wrote, survived all the way down to his own time. In other words, less than 100 years after these events, a man was telling the Roman emperor, you can go ask them, they're still around, the ones who came back. So let's bring this home with 3 things to carry out of here. First, the fact. The Bible records death reversed 10 distinct times across roughly 1,000 years through prophets and apostles, and finally through the Son himself. And in 9 of those 10 cases, it was temporary, alone, not a gift. Only one man walked out of his own grave and left the burial cloths folded behind him. That asymmetry is not an accident. It is the entire point. Second, what it means for you. The same word, iagero, get up. The word you'd use to wake a child on a school morning, idor, is the word spoken over a dead 12-year-old, over a corpse 4 days in the tomb. And according to the New Testament, the word that will one day be spoken over you to the one who said it. Your grave is not a different category of problem than a Tuesday morning alarm clock. It's just time to get up. And third, the one I actually want you to take to bed tonight. You have a grave you are afraid of. Maybe it's your own. Maybe it's one you have already stood beside, with that animal waiting for a breath that didn't come. Here is what these 10 stories are screaming across 3,000 years. The grave is not a wall you slam into. It is a door, and it is not locked from your side with you trapped inside. It was opened from the other side by someone who went in first, on purpose, and is standing in the doorway with his hand out, refusing to let it close. 9 of them came back and died again to show you it could be done. 1 came back and stayed to show you it could be done forever. So here's my question for you, and I really do read these. Which of these 10 did you not know was in the Bible? Be honest. Most people know Lazarus, maybe Jairus' daughter. But the man who came back by falling into a dead prophet's grave? The crowd of saints walking out of cracked tombs into Jerusalem? Tell me below which one you'd never heard of. And tell me which one hit you the hardest and why. Because the strangest thing about all 10 of these stories is not that they happened a long time ago. The strangest thing is that the one who caused them is still right now in the doorway, still holding it open, still saying your name.